Keith, I think you started with a social science degree, and
Yes.
you did national service, and then you joined the BBC after a short period in industry at Cadbury's, I think.
No, the other way around.
Oh, right.
No, I did Cadbury's first from the age of 16. So no, so I left school at 16 and did 2 years with them, and then I did national service. And so it wasn't until the age of, well, obviously the age of 20, when I was looking for work. And I got a surprise letter from Cadbury's. It said, well, there's this new university that's only opened in 1950, the first one to open after the war, called the University College of North Staffordshire.
Yes.
And
became Keele University.
became
Yeah.
Keele University, yes. It's a 3-year degree course, but it's preceded, first of all, by a foundation year, which is kind of sort of the history of Western civilization, really. Would you be interested in going there for a year at our expense? This was Cadbury's talking. I went, and to cut a rather long story short, I went for a year. I was immediately taken with the place, had a terrific time. And towards the end of the year, I wanted to stay for a 3-year degree course. So I wrote to Cadbury's and said, look, you've been very generous. You've funded me for a year. I want to stay and do a degree, and I can get a grant from Birmingham, it was in those days, where I was sort of registered. And they were very good, and they said, well, go with our blessing, yes. So I did that and got a degree. And, of course, at the end of that, what was then a 4-year course, I had to go to Cadbury's and say, sorry, but I don't want to come back to you. What do you feel about that? And being the organisation and the company they were in those days, they said, fine, go with our blessing. Good luck. And I applied to the BBC, and the BBC in those days ran a general training course. They only took about 20 people, I think, onto that. And if you got onto that, you were more or less guaranteed a good job in the BBC at the end of it. I got shortlisted, but I didn't get it. I didn't get on it. And so I thought, oh, what now, you know? And then a few days later, I got another letter from the BBC saying, sorry, you didn't get onto that, but there's something called the training reserve. And with that, you don't get a job guaranteed. We take you in for a year, and you're entitled then to apply for internal vacancies. And if you get one, by the end of the year, you're in. And if you don't get one, you're out. And so, of course, I said yes to that. And that's how I got into the BBC in 56. Well, I started first in London. They gave you immediately a sort of general training course lasting about quite a long time, probably 2 months or so. The training school in those days was in Marylebone Road. I remember it for one. I mean, I remember it for all sorts of reasons, but one particular reason, it had a water-operated lift. You'd be on the ground floor, and you'd press the button, and you could hear flushing up above. You see,
Filled with water.
Yes, and it came down. Yes, and then you got in and pressed the button, and you flushed it the other way. Yes, I've never seen one before or since. Well, that must be pretty rare. But anyway, that was the training school. And I met some really very interesting people on that course, you know, mostly from radio, and I think benefited from it. I didn't excel at it by any means. I remember they took you out on the riverbank and made you talk for 10 minutes like an outside broadcast, live outside broadcast. And it was a grey afternoon, and there was nothing going on the river at all.
Nothing to see.
There's absolutely nothing to describe. So I failed miserably at that. And so I didn't excel at all, really. A lot of the tuition on this course was based on radio, microphone techniques, how to produce a talk, all that kind of thing. Very little on television, although we did do one television exercise. But of course, remember, I was only there for a year, and the onus was on me to get a job, because if at the end of the year I hadn't got a job, I would be out. So I was continually looking for opportunities to get work, to get a job, a post. So I therefore applied for this post in Birmingham, which was on the boards, a bit reluctantly, because I loved being in London. We had a flat, university friends and I, 3 of us shared a flat at Putney, right at the start of the boat race course, because I remember that year we were on the roof watching the boat race. But anyway, so I loved being in London. I very reluctantly applied for this job in Birmingham, and then I got it. I went up for an interview and got it. So although I joined the BBC in September 56, by January 57 I was up in Birmingham holding down a permanent job. So in a sense, it had worked for me. The training reserve had done what it's meant to be, which is to find people and put them into work if they're any good. So, yeah.
I hadn't heard of that particular way of, as it were, getting in. You sort of float around,
Yes.
and you apply for things, and if you don't get anything, you go.
Yes.
Extraordinary.
That's true, yes, that's true.
So Birmingham.
Well, of course, I was born and bred in Birmingham, so it was familiar territory to me. At that stage, the BBC was wishing to expand away from London into the regions. Most of the major regions, Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, and then the national regions, were very radio-based, really. In fact, they didn't have any television, essentially.
No transmitters in many parts of the country.
No, that's right. I mean, the growth of the growth of radio and then the growth of television did in the end depend upon a transmitter network being built, yes. So Birmingham, being physically nearer to London than the others, I suppose, was an obvious place to start the development. And the BBC in Birmingham in those days was in a building in Edgbaston, leafy Edgbaston. It was a former school for the blind. No significance about that, but that's what it was. And when I got there, there was radio, which had been there for quite a while, but very, very little in the way of television. There was a nightly television regional news programme, but that came from a different building in the centre of Birmingham. This one at Edgbaston was the sort of headquarters of the BBC. That's where I was employed as programme services assistant.
So what did you do? What was the daily
round?
Well,
the point of the job was that since the place was developing, the programme had to have services. It had to have a studio. It had to have carpenters and painters and everything you need to put together a television programme. And these had to be administered and organised. And so that was the nature of the job, really. I mean, I found myself doing extraordinary things. By the time I got there, before I got there, the BBC had, I think, rented. I don't think they'd ever purchased it. They rented a disused cinema in Aston, in a suburb of Birmingham, called Gloucester Green. And converted it into a television studio, and so I used to have to go there frequently. I used to take the weekly wages down for the staff, things like that. I used to have to go out with the painter and buy his paintbrushes for him, and it was making it up as you went along almost. I had to deal with the schedule, but that was really a laugh, because if I tell you that the week's output from Gloucester Green was 30 minutes of gardening club with a man called Percy Thrower, a very well-known gardener at the time, and 15 minutes of Keep Fit with Eileen Fowler.
Oh, I remember her.
Now,
yes.
Those 45 minutes together was the weekly output from the studio when I arrived. So green behind the ears as I was, it didn't take me much effort to schedule that every week.
What sort of equipment did you have?
I think the studio had 3 cameras. Of course, the intention was to grow on that, and what it had was a small group of producers who were, on the whole, television people. They weren't radio people who'd converted. They'd been recruited in all sorts of different ways as television people. In those days, I don't think it happens any longer, but in those days, if you were a television producer in the region, you were a non-specialist. You did everything. You would direct the test match at Edgbaston, and then the next week you'd be directing a circus. So it was an enormous range of output they did, and it was small at the beginning, and it all depended upon London, in a sense, in their generosity, giving Birmingham something to do. It was hosted output. It was output which sort of belonged to London, but was done in Birmingham as a way of getting Birmingham started. And it worked very well. And so we started to do drama. We started to do light entertainment in Gloucester Green and as outside broadcasts. And we had an outside broadcast unit based in Birmingham. And that's the way the network developed. I mean, beyond the shores of Birmingham, it went to Manchester. They had a big outside broadcast unit. So did Bristol. And so the network gradually grew from London. A lot of it was OB based.
Oh, so you had scanners as well as
You had
studios,
scanners.
yeah.
We had scanners, that's right. So that was the way it developed. And that went on very happily, and I was enjoying it very much. During that period, the Tonight programme started. I can't give you the exact date of that, but it must have been round about 58, something like that. The Tonight programme, which was the early evening Cliff Mitchell-Moore show that was introduced to fill what was called the toddler's truce. There was a toddler's truce between something like 5:30 and 6:30, something like that, when nothing happened because the kiddies had got to be got to bed. And so that was filled by the Tonight programme and became very successful very quickly. But it depended a lot on inserts from all over the place.
That was Cliff Mitchell-Moore.
Cliff Mitchell-Moore, yes. And we used to therefore be called upon quite often to provide studio space for an idea they had, or they wanted ideas from us.
Let me just get this clear. The output from those studios in Birmingham were networked. I mean, they were going out all over the country. They weren't simply it wasn't local television at all.
The regional news was local,
the
of
regional
course.
news, yeah.
There was also a half-hour regional current affairs slot. That's gone on till this day, really, that idea of having a nightly regional news and a half-hour current affairs. Apart from that, yes, everything was network. It was a really big adventure once a year when the outside broadcast unit went to East Anglia. It went to East Anglia for a trip lasting 3 weeks or something. And while it was out there, it would do live outside broadcasts from the pier at Great Yarmouth, or a documentary, in quotes, a sort of documentary on the Broads or something. They would do 4 or 5 different programmes in that period. And that was a high watermark of the output for the year, as it were.
This was all A, black and white, B, live.
Yes.
Really, before you recorded anything, you had telecine.
Yes.
And that was about it.
That's right. So we had no videotape, not in those days. That's right. It was all live. And I very quickly wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of production. I didn't want to be in an office pushing round a schedule or something.
Right. So then what did you do after that?
Well, the Midland region, as that was called, also as well as Birmingham, had Norwich as a radio output, doing local and network radio from a building in Norwich. And coming up over the horizon was Anglia Television, based in Norwich. And the BBC notoriously never likes to be beaten on any new development. And so it was very anxious to start television in some way from Norwich before Anglia got on the air. And what fairly obviously it decided to do was a nightly regional television news programme like the one that was coming from Birmingham, but do one from Norwich for the whole of East Anglia. And by then, the transmitter network allowed that to happen, allowed that to have a separate programme. So a studio was built onto the back of the existing building in Norwich, which was a lovely sort of Georgian, attractive house in the centre of Norwich. And the time came when they had to recruit the staff to run this programme. The target date was 1959, in the autumn of 1959, to get on the air before Anglia got on the air was the ambition. So the job was advertised of director, someone to go out and direct a nightly television regional news programme. And I applied for that with no experience at all. I hadn't done any direction. I'd looked after these inserts for the Tonight programme, but that wasn't really no more than pointing a camera at someone and they did their piece. So I thought, well, I won't get it. And I think to this day I have to thank my boss, Peter Cairns, really, I think he did me a good turn. I remember my competitor was a man called John Davis, who was a PA. Anyway, John Davis was competing, and he had a lot more experience than I. He'd done directing in Birmingham. And so for me to get the job instead of him was, I think, a surprise to everybody, certainly to me. I may have done John a good turn in the end, because he went on to be a very distinguished and reputable drama director, doing an amazing output. So he probably benefited from not going to Norwich, which was a bit of a backwater in a way. But anyway, I was pleased to go to the backwater. And so I got the job, and the programme was, by then, the programme was due to go on air sort of 3 weeks later, something like that. So I was sent out with an experienced director from Birmingham for 1 week. He did all the rehearsals, and I sat at his elbow, and he taught me how to do it, really. And we went on air, and he did the first week's transmission, and then he came back and I took over. So I had a week of baptism, as it were, and then I took over, directing a nightly, then it was 10 minutes, a 10-minute programme, in a small studio with only 2 cameras and a turret lens on the front, which hold 4 lenses, but only 2 were supplied. So, of course you couldn't change a lens in vision. You didn't have to take the top off to change it. You could rotate the lens turret, but out of vision.
Out of vision, yeah.
And so you had to cut away to a caption on the other camera or something while you rotated the lens on the main camera. So all those restrictions were there. There was no videotape. We shot our film inserts on 16mm and transmitted it in negative, because there was no time to process and print the film.
So you edited it?
Yes. A typical working day would be morning meeting. You decide, what stories you're going to cover. We had some staff reporters by then, and we had freelance camera crews, only 2 or 3 of them, and I think all of them had been recruited, in a sense, from camera shops, i.e. from people who'd spent the years before then doing weddings, taking still pictures at weddings and maybe moving pictures at weddings as well, and had no experience of making, news coverage. So they were learning as well. So we were all learning. And so I'd have the morning meeting, then I'd go out with a reporter and this camera crew and shoot the story wherever it was, direct it, and then come back, rush it to the labs, which were the same labs that had been producing wedding pictures for years and years. And the material would get back into the building as negative, still as negative, and be edited as negative. Well, as most people know, I think, if you get a scratch on negative, it's there forever. You can't remove it. There's no way in which you can. So very often, I'm afraid, the material went out on air pretty badly damaged, and it showed. So, I mean, it was pretty ropey quality, but never mind, we did it. And we did get on the air before Anglia. And Anglia, of course, came only about 3 weeks later with full guns blazing. I mean, they came up over the top of the hill with their emblem was a I seem to remember it was a silver knight on a horse or something. Yes. And they did a full service, they had a full broadcast service from morning to evening, with a very popular lunchtime show and a longer regional television news and hours. And so, I mean, they wiped us off the face of the earth. The fact is, we were first.
Yes.
We were there first.
A Pyrrhic victory.
Fairly quickly, I think there were 12 in the end, 12 regional television, and there still are 12 regional television stations in the BBC. All producing a nightly television news for their area.
But with ITV stations popping up and able to produce much better funded material.
Yes.
And presumably dramas and things like that, and from nice new studios.
That's right. I think the history of the BBC at that time was entirely television starting in converted buildings, not custom-built buildings.
Yes,
that might not be
old
true.
Churches.
Yes,
like
that's
that,
right.
Yeah.
It was literally an old church in Manchester, I seem to remember.
Yes, it was. Yes, Dickinson Road.
That's right, Dickinson Road. Yes, maybe the national regions had large broadcasting houses from early days, perhaps custom built, but certainly not the English region.
But the aim always was to go to London eventually, was it?
Well, I was content at first. We got there in '59, got married in '61, and we my wife and I set up home in Norwich, and we were very happy, and the work remained interesting. At the same time, and it grew in the sense that the monthly current affairs program, television current affairs program, was started, called Outlook, produced by a very entertaining and clever man called Malcolm Freegard. And I was therefore moved from news to him. And so for a while, quite a long time, a couple of years or so, I directed the current affairs show, which was much more ambitious. It was half an hour of television. And we did a lot of interesting stories and historical programs and documentaries of one kind and another. So I began to get a taste for that. And I did start to get very itchy feet, thinking, well, I looked around me and I thought, I don't think I want to spend the next 30 years here, really.
No, but it had given you an extraordinarily wide opportunity, really, of directing all sorts of things. And
yes.
And
yes, and we were helped in the early days when I was on the news with visiting directors and reporters from London, from the newsroom in London, who, it was in their interest to make sure that people out in the sticks were decently trained and were competent, because, of course, one of the tasks of a regional newsroom is to feed the network with news stories. If a story breaks in East Anglia that's important enough for the national news, and the local reporter does it, he's got to be good to be on the network. Incidentally, one of the young chaps who turned up out of the blue to work in Norwich was Martin Bell. And he and I went out on many stories, with me director and Martin as a reporter. I fairly rapidly realised that Martin didn't need a director. He was actually so good. And of course, in a very short time, he was in London and made that huge reputation for himself as a national reporter. So there I was doing monthly programmes, getting a bit itchy feet. And then something very unexpected happened. We had on the staff there an agricultural producer called Gordon Mosley, who'd been there for quite some time, initially in radio. And then once regional television news started, he was used as a sort of farming correspondent on television news regularly, because one of the troubles with being in a place like East Anglia, frankly, there isn't much news. On the morning meeting, we'd look around at one another and, what are we going to put in the programme tonight? So very often we lent heavily on Gordon and his colleagues to provide us with news stories, because the farming is very important in East Anglia, obviously. And his reputation grew, I think, and that was the reason why he was offered the chance of producing a network television series. Now, that was manna from heaven for a place like Norwich, to actually produce something on the network from a small place like Norwich. And the idea was 6 half hours, and the subject was dairy farming. And so Gordon came to me and said, look, I've said we'll do this. He said, and I'm going to produce it. Would you like to come and direct it? This would have been around about 64, perhaps, something like that, 64. It meant a year. It was going to take it seems extraordinary, doesn't it, to take a year, although maybe not that extraordinary, to take a year to make 6 half hours, because it was across the UK. We had to go to everywhere from Aberdeen to Belfast to shoot the stuff. So my wife and I had a long chat, do I continue to try to batter doors down to get to London, or do I just say, well, let's delay that for a year while I do this? And we decided, actually, that was going to be a very good experience. And so it was. I went everywhere with Gordon, up and down the country, shooting sequences. Gained experience doing that, I think, and learnt a lot. I mean, I was a townie, born and bred in Birmingham. I didn't know the front end of a cow from the back end. I really didn't. Gordon had to quietly explain to me on day one that unless a cow calves every year, the milk doesn't keep on coming. You see?
Yes.
If you're a townie, you don't quite understand that. But anyway, so I learned a lot about dairy farming, and I had quite a big part to play in the production of the booklet as well. Which comes every educational series gets a booklet, doesn't it? And that had to be written and produced. And
so this was a networked program about dairy farming.
Yes,
that went out
on Thursday lunchtime. I think it was carefully worked out that was a time when farmers could relax and watch television. It was live from Norwich, and it was 6.5 hours in the autumn. It was called Dairy Farming, and I directed the studio element of it when it went out.
So the work was basically preparing film inserts for it.
Yes, and then doing studio demonstrations, and we had a very good vet who became a very good friend of mine after that, and other good specialists. I think it was a decent professional program and dealt with the subject very well, and was well received by the farming industry. Yeah. So
So it was also including news for farmers, new techniques, new details about diseases or whatever.
That's right. Yeah. Trying to deal with all the problems a dairy farmer faces.
Yes.
Everything from veterinary problems to costing problems to the management of the farm, etc., etc.
Right. Hope it didn't clash with the Archers.
No, of course the Archers was in Birmingham.
Yes.
The Archers in Birmingham.
Yes. And of course radio.
Yes.
Right. So what about the move to London then after you got this experience?
Yes. Even while I was doing that, I kept on moaning about the fact that, could I not somehow... In those days, the BBC had a very good system of attachments. Mm. If you got one, you could go to another department anywhere in the UK on attachment for a limited period, usually 3 months. To see for them to see if you were any good and would they like to employ you permanently or not, and B, for you to see whether you liked the idea of being there. So that was the obvious way to move. It was a well-recognised way of moving around the corporation. And so I banged on doors to try and get an attachment to London. And eventually I got one. And got sent to London. And I was attached to Current Affairs Department in London.
Lime Grove, presumably.
To Lime Grove, yes. And it's a curious arrangement because there's no formality about what work you might end up doing. You just have to kind of be there and make a slight nuisance of yourself and express a willingness to work. And a willingness literally to do everything from making the tea to, anything, in order to gradually get experience. And I was, because I'd got by then quite a few years' experience directing, and I wanted to go on doing that. I mean, my ambition when I arrived was to direct a network current affairs program. That was my initial ambition. But I knew I wasn't going to get there straight away. But I remember the very first assignment I was given was to direct Sky at Night, because I think the people there thought, well, Sky at Night, what was it, 10 or 15 minutes or something? That's more or less what this chap's used to doing. He probably let him loose on that without coming to any harm, sort of thing.
But dealing with Patrick Moore.
Yes, that's right. And a producer called Paul Bonner, I think was his name.
Paul Bonner, yes.
And they gave me a chance, and I was delighted because, you get your name on a credit.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. I did 2 or 3, I can't remember how many, but I was really with Current Affairs. And I was fairly rapidly attached to a program called 24 Hours. Now, 24 Hours was the sort of that day's equivalent of what is now Newsnight, i.e. it's a late night Current Affairs program, produced by a man called Derek Amor, who was easily the best program editor I ever worked for, a maverick, an eccentric in many ways, but a genius in some ways. But anyway, and so I was just part of the production team, producing items for the program, writing scripts, and continually nagging away, saying, couldn't I have a go at directing, And eventually they said, yeah, okay, we'll do this afternoon recording, have a go at that. And I did that all right. And eventually they said, all right, well, come on the rota and have a go. So I did end up directing 24 Hours.
Now, was that the equivalent of Newsnight in a sense?
Yes. I mean, Newsnight now is under the firm control of News Department and has been for a number of years.
But in those days there was news and there was current affairs.
Yes,
there
quite
were
separate. Quite separate. And it wasn't as though they cooperated very well. They were actually competitors, yes. I think that was the downfall eventually of current affairs. I think it was thought to be silly that these two factual programs should be competitors. Yes. I could argue at some length that the amalgamation of current affairs and news was a mistake. And if you wished me to, I could go on and give you some reasons for that. But at that time, it was firmly separate.
But was news at Alexandra Palace and then current affairs was at Lime
Grove? Yes, and then news eventually moved from Alexandra Palace to Television Centre.
Yes. So it made sense in a sort of way to be different
because they were geographically separate. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
yes.
But then they came together at Television Centre. So you were around when Television Centre opened, then,
yes.
were you? Yeah.
Yes, I was. I was in Lime Grove when Television Centre opened, yes.
That must have been rather dramatic when it opened. These
yes.
massively over-engineered studios.
Yes.
Brilliantly designed.
I mean, they didn't... My memory is they didn't open the whole complex in one go. I mean, they opened, I think, a couple of studios first of all, and then the third studio. And so, it was a gradual opening process. Yes, and we all felt in Lime Grove, we were physically separate, obviously, but we felt separate in all sorts of emotional ways and structural ways, really. We did feel, and I think that provoked a kind of slight atmosphere of rebellion, against the bosses at Television Centre.
Yes.
We like to think we did it our way and it was better than their way.
Yes, you had a lot of maverick and very good reporters, if I remember.
Yes, very good reporters. Current Affairs was not the only programme from Lime Grove, of course.
Well, there's Panorama.
Yes, but that also was Current Affairs, of course. Yes, yes. Current Affairs as a department did a lot of output. It did nightly programs like 24 Hours. It did weekly programs like the Money Programme and Panorama. And it was the go-to department for big projects, for general elections. And when something huge came along, like the Apollo programs, for example, Current Affairs did it.
Tell me about the Apollo thing. Take that as a perfectly, beautiful example of something which involved a huge amount of resources, a lot of sort of thinking on your feet because things are happening.
Yes.
And you don't know quite what is happening. How was it? And there was a studio going all the time, wasn't there?
Yes, I was at that time. I'd moved to Nationwide. 69 Nationwide began, and I moved across from. Well, 24 Hours came to an end, and there was a short gap, but then Newsnight started. But by then I'd moved to Nationwide as the director.
Now that was mid-evening.
Mid-evening, 6 till 7. A new concept. It was a bit like the Tonight programme, really, in the sense that the BBC needed something early evening to hold on to the audience. And Nationwide's job was to do that.
These were the days of Fife Robinson and people like that.
That's right. A team of very good reporters, some of whom had been on 24 Hours originally and came across to Nationwide. Derek Amor was the producer of Nationwide, editor of Nationwide, and he had this concept. His working paper, when it was first sort of thought about, was called Britain at 6. And we all started to gather together as a production team to try and make this thing work. And it became very clear that Britain at 6 was not a title that would be allowed for the straightforward reason that where was Northern Ireland? And right up until press day, literally until press day, there was no decision about what to call the programme. And various other titles were invented and put to Northern Ireland, and they said, no, come on, can we remind you what the United Kingdom is? It's the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland. We've got to be in there somewhere. You can't call it Britain at 6, you see. And I think one of the fairly junior members of the staff came up with the word nationwide.
Good name, yes.
And the press was literally on the phone to Derek Amor saying, look, Radio Times, we're going to press. What's it going to be called? And Derek said, OK, nationwide.
Brilliant. Great story, that.
Yes.
Very nice story.
And the Irish said, yeah, all right, we'll accept that because we know we can pretend we're part of the nation. Sorry, I digress. The Apollo, there was a space program before Apollo, and then they kept sending off ever-increasing, complicated and...
Yes, but the actual moon landing
The actual moon landing was 69, but there'd been 2 or 3 missions before that, getting into orbit first of all, and then it was all sparked off by the Russians, of course, initially, getting a man into orbit first, and then sending a rocket round the moon and back again safely. So it built up gradually, and our team built up gradually to do it. James Burke was the main presenter, and interestingly now, looking back, there wasn't as much interest in broadcasting this story as you would think there should have been. I mean, for example, the mission that went round the moon for the first time, there was very little interest in broadcasting news about that. It happened on Christmas Eve. Not a good time to get together a group of people to do live programmes, And one of the production team, a man called Tam Fry, I'll give him credit now for having the energy and the will, even on Christmas Eve, to say, look, we've got to be there when this rocket goes around the moon and comes back round the other side, because nobody knows if it will ever come back. It's never been done before.
And was it taking photographs of the
no
of the other side? It wasn't.
No,
it was simply going around.
That's right.
Oh, I see. So
all you got was the NASA soundtrack.
Yeah. So because there were no pictures, it lacked domestic interest. Yeah.
And Tam on Christmas Eve took himself up to Press B, which was a tiny little studio belonging to presentation department, and some picture of the moon behind them with James Burke. And went on air and broadcast the space rocket going behind the moon, and then however long it took, silence and nothing, and then it emerged the other side. And then, of course, by the time we get to the moon landing,
then we're getting pictures. Then
we're in the serious business of broadcasting this story to the nation, of course.
But how were the pictures got back? Is this before or after, Telstar and all these things?
Well, all that communication by satellite was developing at the same time, really. As satellites began to develop, I can remember directing the first live transmission from across the channel, from Calais, with Richard Dimbleby, and the first live transmission by satellite from the States. So it was all gradually developing at the same time. And the exact sequence of events, I would have to do a lot of research to remember that.
But you'll remember the actual moon landing itself, because that's the one.
Yes, now 1969, the moon, the Apollo program. So we were on the air for regular slots right throughout the 24 hours, really. I mean, a sequence of 24 hours. And there were some interesting problems to be solved. One of them being, what do you put on the screen when you've got no pictures, really? I mean, it was one thing to televise live the launch, of course. You could do that and see it disappear into the sky. But you didn't get any pictures after that. You got pictures of the separation of the space sections, but once it was on its way to the moon, you really got no pictures. The interesting debate that we had all the time was, as you got to the moment where the rocket was going to land, what do you show? You've got NASA soundtrack, but you can't entirely rely on that, because they made it quite clear that if there was any problem they didn't want the world to know about, they would just cut the feed and you'd be left listening to nothing. And so what do you do? So we made an animation. We made an animation of Apollo 11 going through the sky on the way to the moon. The trouble with that, David, was that however well you do it, it looks like a cartoon. You know, it's a graphic, and this is not just a historic moment in the history of mankind and the world. You know, it's more than that, isn't it? Landing on the moon, for goodness sake. You know, do you really want to show a kind of silly-looking graphic going through the sky with James Burke pretending that what you're looking at is the real thing when, of course, you're not? So having made it, we were in great debate about whether to show it, whether what we should just do actually is to do it on still pictures with pictures of the moon, and big photo blobs in the studio, and a lot of pontificating from the experts about what might or might not happen. And James Burke was superb at doing that with his small team of people who joined him. Patrick Moore, of course. Yeah. We did show the animation. I mean, I was directing on that night of the moon landing, and we showed the animation. In the end, I ran it. There was so much conversation going behind as to whether to show it or not. So in the end, I said, cue animation. We ran it, you know, just for a minute or so, and we kind of got it. Nobody minded very much, and we got away with it, but we didn't last it, you know, for very long. But then as the Apollo went towards the moon, we certainly showed the impact. We showed the impact of the rocket landing on the surface of the moon and the dust flying up. Honestly, I can't quite remember whether there was a time delay on it.
Because the impression that you have looking back, I seem to remember that one saw Armstrong and getting off onto the surface of the moon, and that was live.
Yes.
Now, is that the case?
That was live.
Right.
But I think the impact might have been a slight time delay, because frankly, no one was sure whether it would work. And I don't think NASA was very keen on the world seeing this capsule clearly crash land. So I think there was a slight time delay of as it were, releasing the pictures. But we did see the legs of the rocket impact the surface, and the words, you know, the eagle has landed.
Yes, and all that.
And all that. And certainly by the time, and then there was a long delay while all sorts of things were checked inside the capsule before they emerged, and we saw the Armstrong coming down live down that ladder onto the surface of the moon. Yes, because by then, it had landed safely. There was not the as it were, so worries.
By that time, they wanted you to.
They wanted us to see it. Yes, and all the movement on the surface of the moon, which didn't last all that long. That first mission, they were only out there for about an hour, I think, before they got back inside. And of course, then the following days were very dramatic, really. I mean, we televised live the takeoff from the moon, and then again, was the engine going to fire? Yes. What happened if it didn't? Yeah. What happened if that stuck down the surface? Two guys there slowly dying on the surface of the moon.
Presumably, the only reason that you would think that something serious had happened was that if you didn't have any information.
Yes, that's right. Again, I was directing as the thing came up from the moon and locked in with the mothership, and then the journey back. But then you got to the really heart-stopping few minutes of entry, and then again, although this had been practiced on previous missions that hadn't gone all the way to land on the moon, they'd circled and come back safely 2 or 3 times, so the techniques had been practiced. Nevertheless, it's a very, very dangerous moment, and remains a dangerous moment for every spaceship that comes back into the Earth's atmosphere.
But the Americans were throwing everything at it in terms of transmitting things via satellite to as many countries as they could. Supply. Presumably.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, and I have a clear memory that there was a finite amount of time of radio silence when the capsule entered the Earth's atmosphere before it emerged with the parachutes. Something like, I don't know what it was, 2 or 3 minutes. It wasn't long, but it was fine. Yes. And so that time went up to the almost like a second countdown, and there was still silence.
Yeah, so there were a lot of very dramatic moments, but long periods in between when people had to fill in with speculation or technical descriptions or whatever.
Yes, and that's when James Burke was very, very good, yes. Yeah. And then we saw the parachutes, and then, well, you know the rest, yes. And then after that, there were successive Apollo missions. The next one had the vehicle called Lunar Rover, travelling around the surface, and then more elaborate missions. But they came to an end eventually. Well, of course, Apollo 13 was the dramatic one. Yes. And there's quite an interesting story there. Apollo 13, which was 2 missions later. We covered the launch. We covered the launch of Apollo 13. And it took something like, I can't remember the exact time, it's something like 2.5 days to get to the moon. And that happened to coincide with a budget. And we were in TC7. We were the same program unit that produced by-elections and budgets. And so it was thought, well, there's nothing actually to tell people or to televise while the thing's on its way to the moon. We may as well do the budget. And so that was planned. And I think it was, funnily, it was a Tuesday. I think Thursday is usually a budget day. I think it was a Tuesday. And I arrived that morning expecting to direct a programme of the budget with maybe the odd 2-minute report that Apollo was still safely on its way. And I went into the control room, and one of my colleagues, Tam, was ashen-faced on the phone, and he'd just received the NASA message, "We have a problem here." And Apollo 13 had exploded. And there then followed, I suppose, one of the most extraordinary days I experienced directing television, really. Instead, from that same studio, we covered the Apollo story and the budget unexpectedly, and the scene men were very busy all day long taking down the Apollo backing and putting up the budget, and then taking down the budget, putting up Apollo, because it was a small studio, you know. And there was one period in the middle of the afternoon where we broadcast simultaneously on 2 channels from the same studio, one giving an Apollo report and one giving budget news. I don't think that's probably happened again, but we did it. But in different corners of the studio. Yes. So that was a budget, and it didn't do the Labour Party any good. They got defeated at the next election. So, and we covered the what would have been the tragedy, but in the end the triumph of getting Apollo 13 back.
I mean, this was heavy duty stuff, wasn't it? I mean, heady stuff, shall we say? Where do you go from there?
Some people, colleagues of mine, went on happily directing all their lives. Subsequently, used to look back with some envy, because it was the one job I did that I got most pleasure from. Directing was the thing I most enjoyed doing. But I was on Nationwide. I'd been doing it for quite a while, and there came the possibility of being an assistant editor on the programme, and I applied for that and got it. So I became one of the 2 assistant editors. John Morrell was the other one, a colleague of mine, and he and I, between us, ran the programme really for a period, doing sort of 3 days at a time and 3 days off, that kind of shift, you know.
General elections, did you do?
And during that time, yes, I directed the results programme. That's the one that starts when the polls close at 10 and goes most of the way through the night till about 4 o'clock, picks up again at about 8 the following morning through till about 3 in the afternoon when the new Prime Minister goes to the palace. That programme. It was always an ambition of mine to direct that. Yeah. Yes, if you're a current affairs studio director, the one thing you really want to do is to direct the general election programme. And I was lucky because I did 3 in the end, because there were 2 in 1974, because the first one was a very narrow majority, and then there was a second one in the autumn. And then the one in 79 was the one when Thatcher got in. So I directed 3 general election programmes. By the third one, I had already moved from current affairs. I was sort of looking for something else to do, really. I wasn't being as objective as one can about one's own skills. I think I was a better director than a producer. In fact, I know I was a better director than a producer. I wasn't a particularly good producer, I didn't think, although I did it and I was the assistant editor. But I wasn't particularly happy in doing it. I was moved off Nationwide to a regeneration of the Tonight programme. This was a late evening version of the Tonight programme. It wasn't anything like the original Tonight programme. It was a late night current affairs programme, and I was one of the producers that was put onto it to bring it to air, as it were. There was a crazy idea that every one day a week would be an outside broadcast, and I was given that task, finding an outside broadcast. Well,
when nothing was going on,
basing a program content on the machinery you use is a ridiculous concept when you think about it.
Right. Yes.
And we succeeded for 5 or 6 weeks, but it quickly collapsed on us as an idea, and I was very fed up, and I was looking for something else to do, and the job was advertised to run television training.
Was that at Woodstock Grove?
Yes. And it was only what attracted me to it was I thought it was an interesting thing to get involved in, but also it was only a 2-year assignment, and you were guaranteed your job back in your department at the end of it. If you wanted to do it, apply for it if you get it, but you'd get your job back. Now we all know that promise is okay, but it might not come about like that. So there was a slightly risky element to it. But anyway, I applied for it and got it. And it was while I was beginning to run television training that the 1979 came round. And I'd been involved in all the rehearsals, because the rehearsals for the general election go on spasmodically all the time, working out how the computer works and everything. And I'd been involved in all that. So I managed to win the argument against some trade union opposition that I should be allowed to do another results programme, because there were other directors who also fancied doing it, And they said, yes, okay, that makes sense. So I went back to current affairs from television training for a short time to direct the 1979 general election results programme. And it was a mixed blessing. It was a mixed blessing. Basically, we screwed up the beginning and end of the programme, and everything in between for 12 hours was pretty good, I thought. But we screwed up the beginning and we screwed up the end.
Why?
Well, you screw up the beginning by missing the first result. And that's like missing the penalty in a cup final, that's going to win the game for you. And it all happened, nothing to do with us, but it happened. We were sitting there waiting for the first results. And what happens in those circumstances, you're never quite sure who's going to be first. There's usually 2 or 3 constituencies battling to be first. So you got your eye on 2 or 3 outputs and 2 or 3 monitors, not wanting to go to them too early, to when there's nothing to say, going to them just at the right moment when the election is being declared. And one of the 3 was Glasgow Central. And we'd got our eye on Glasgow Central, and it became fairly increasingly obvious that Glasgow was probably going to win. The returning officers were gathering on the platform and all that preparatory to, you see. And so we were waiting for the moment to go across to Glasgow Central. And just at that precise moment, the picture disappeared. The picture disappeared from Glasgow. I think to this day, Scotland sabotaged us, because they successfully broadcast the result on their own network in Scotland. But we didn't broadcast it.
They blamed the links.
For the rest of the nation. They blamed the links, that's right, or the engineering switch or something. And for about 45 seconds there was chaos, because I didn't know what the hell was going on. I had no picture to cut to. David Dimbleby, it was his first results programme, because the first 2 I did was with Alistair Burnett. Oh, yeah. But David did the first one in 1979, and somehow we got through that. We got the results, obviously, by text or radio or something very quickly, and declared that it gave the result. But we'd missed the moment. And you knew once you'd done that, you'd really you hadn't broadcast the first result.
How did David Dimbleby cope with it?
Remarkably well, really. He showed his real professionalism. I have enormous admiration for him. I think he's absolutely first-rate broadcaster. And he sort of took it in his stride and went on with the show. And I had to do the same, and everyone else involved. Move forward now to the following afternoon. And we get to 2:30, 3 o'clock. And the results has long since been declared. Thatcher's won by a good majority. And Alistair Burnett and Bob Mackenzie and David Butler are sitting there in the studio, jabbering away. They have talked through every possible combination of speculation about what might happen, and Thatcher has gone to the palace. And we've run all our videotape standby clips. We've got nothing else to show the audience. We just have got chat. And the housewives of the nation were up in arms because it got to something like 4:00 when Jackanory was scheduled, and the nation's children were crying. And they were ringing the controller and saying, "This is ridiculous. We got 3 men in the studio with nothing to say, and our children want their story." And the controller of BBC One, in the end, took a huge gamble and sort of gave in and instructed us to come off air. And so I had to say to David, "Oh, sorry, David, but we'll come back. Of course, we'll come back when the Thatcher's back.
Yes, and Jackanory's over.
But we're going off air for the moment, so sign off." And and he did that. And about 30 seconds later, Thatcher emerged from Buckingham Palace on her way to Downing Street. And she got to Downing Street and delivered the message about Francis of Assisi. And you remember she quoted from Francis of Assisi on the steps of Number 10, and we were transmitting a bedtime story. And of course, when that was over, we got back, but we'd missed the moment. We ran it, we recorded it and ran it, but it's late.
But ITV, of course, had been there.
ITV had a field day. We missed the beginning and we missed the ending, and it will scar my heart until I die, David. Even though I couldn't be held directly to blame for either event.
Carve the word Jackanory on your tombstone.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. But you've had a terrific time, though, nonetheless. You had a bite at television training. I remember the Woodstock Grove place, and I remember doing my production exercise there. Those production courses were incredibly good. 8-week courses on directing, and one learnt to do everything.
Yes.
It was it was training, and also the attachment system that was so good about the BBC in those days, I think. And I'm not sure what happens with training now, whether people get trained in a general way or whether they just go into departments and work as freelancers and get kicked out.
Yeah, there's no training school any longer.
No,
I don't think. No,
quite.
If I may just digress slightly, during the training, I was asked by the controller of services, or whatever his title was, if I would hold 2 big seminars to teach people, really, to teach production staff, not coming on a course, but just on a one-day event, 2 bits of important technical development. The first one was the use of the single camera, lightweight single camera, was on the way in. It was being used, but people didn't know about it. They didn't know what its capacity was, etc., etc. And so I held a one-day seminar in TC6, where the big audience capacity was, for anybody from any production departments to come and spend the day with us learning about this new bit of kit. And that worked very well. And it worked so well that a few months later, while I was still with television training, I was asked to, as it were, present another one-day seminar on electronic effects, which again was a new development which people were beginning to learn about. LE producers in particular were beginning to exploit the way it could be used and all that.
Do you mean things like chroma key?
Not specifically chroma key, no. In fact, not chroma key. Electronic effects, effects,
TVs,
computer-driven effects.
Yes,
really.
Transitions and things like that.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and so we did a one-day seminar on that, which again was very successful. Yeah. Now, you mentioned chroma key. I'd like to point out that while I was in Nationwide, because I suppose I was the senior current affairs director at that time, I conducted the early experiments in chroma key in this to find out how it could be used in current affairs. I mean, it's used, its modern equivalent is used extensively now, of course. But in those days, it was all a bit strange, and we didn't quite know, how it would work.
And there was an issue of veracity, wasn't there, about whether we were showing people something that was true.
Yes, there was a bit of that, but the technical problems were worse than that, really. Yes. We had engineers coming to us saying, well, the only way you're going to make this work, and I'm sorry to have to tell you this, they said to me, the only way to work is to sit your presenter in a very large armchair with a very high back, so that his entire frame is surrounded by furniture. Yes. And then the blue behind will work, but anything approaching his hair and the edge of his suit
will never spilled off the edge
will never work. You see, that was the message we were getting from the engineers. You see, and we had to try to, in a sense, prove them wrong. But, well, we didn't do it. The engineers themselves, in the end, worked out ways of doing it. Yeah. But so I was involved in all that. But yes, moving forward. It got to the end of my television training, and I wanted to hold the business to their promise of letting me go back to my job. But I could see already that where was I to go back? I didn't particularly want to go back to be a assistant editor of somebody, because I'd already done that and hadn't liked it very much. Now, during this time, and I can't quite remember, I had a short attachment to program planning. It was while I was with Current Affairs, before television training. I had a short attachment to program planning. It was offered, and I thought that was an interesting little area of the television service that I didn't know about.
Was that when Joanna Spicer was running it?
Yes, and the man I worked with was a man called John Duteau. I enjoyed it. It was totally different work from producing programs, but I enjoyed it. So when I came back from television training, I was quite interested in exploring that sort of area,
What did a program planner do? I mean, plan programs, but they weren't commissioning programs. They were scheduling.
Well, I can only answer that question by describing the job I then took, because at that time they changed it. A new controller arrived in the shape of Brian Wenham to run BBC Two. Bill Cotton was already running BBC One, but they changed the structure of planning. In those days, there used to be forward planning and current planning. So you had a team of people looking after things that were very close to transmission, both in resources, getting all the resources together to get the thing on air, and planning the current schedule with radio times and all that. They changed all that, and that was across both channels. They changed all that and made a vertical division, so that there was a team of planners on BBC One, resources and transmission, and a team of planners on BBC Two. And they advertised the two jobs of head of planning BBC One and head of planning BBC Two. And I was lucky, because these jobs came available to compete for at the time I was looking for something else to do, and so I applied, and I got the job of head of planning BBC Two. So to answer your question, what I did was to help Brian in the whole business of commissioning programs, and then planning the schedule to transmit them. That was our job. And so we were involved in the two stages of commissioning, which was, first of all, editorials, i.e. early meetings with program departments, trying to decide what they and what the controller wanted to be done the following year. And then, and that was usually, I don't think, in the spring. And we used to travel to the departments. That was something Brian introduced. Before that, they all used to come to London, but Brian said, no, we'll go to them, which meant it was easy for
meeting producers,
easy for London departments to, sure. But it also meant going to all the regions and the national regions. Yeah. So we did that, and we loved that, of course. That was very nice. But also, I think it paid off hugely in terms of the attitude between the program makers out in Glasgow or wherever it was. And the controllers.
So you were meeting producers as well as the
heads
of
we were. Yes.
Yeah, and they were saying we'd like to do a series on this.
That's right. And so those the editorial. Then we'd get it all back. Brian would decide out of a huge mass of stuff how many things he wanted to progress with, not necessarily commission, but progress with. So the costings were done. The costings were done on those. And then in the autumn, you all met together again, but this time in London, to discuss in more detail what all things were going to cost, and which in the end could be afforded, and which we went to and which we had to reluctantly lose. And then the programmes got made. And then the next stage for us as planners was the working out of the schedule to get the things transmitted in the correct way, in the best possible way.
And these were the famous days of above the line and below the line.
Yes.
Resources.
Yes.
And you were allocated resources, and
that's right.
Certain things didn't appear in your budget, or you didn't worry about them.
That's right.
Like the cost of TC1.
That's right. Yeah. This was before the days of producer choice and all that.
Yes. Well, we'll come on to him.
Yes. So yes, and I enjoyed that. I liked that job very much. I really enjoyed that job. And during that time, interestingly, I got attached back. It worked in reverse this time, twice to current affairs. Once to direct the 1979 general election, which I've already described to you.
Yes, sure.
And then the second time, Ron Neal was about to launch Breakfast Time, and he said, would I come back? Would I come back to Current Affairs and help him launch Breakfast Time? And my job, what he wanted me to do, was to organise the entire look of the show, the set, the design, and more importantly, in a way, the direction of it, and train directors to do it. For a limited period, it was only going to last 6 months at the most. I think I joined them in something like November, and we went on the air in something like February, something like that. And I stayed with them for a couple of months after that. And that was very enjoyable, I loved being back making programmes again, and it was something I could do. I knew about directing, and it was something I was able to do, and trained up a team of directors to do what was a unique program, really. We'd never done an early morning program like that at that length before.
This was before TVA.
This again, reverting back to Norwich, the BBC was desperate to be on the air first. It wanted to beat TVAM, and in all the build up to the program, we kept hearing stories about how fantastic TVM was going to be, how they were doing these amazing opening sequences with sequences on a battleship and God knows what, and they were going to astonish us, and they got this lunar list of talent from David Frost, endless list of talent, and they were going to beat living daylights out of us. And we went on the air with Frank Boff in a jumper and Selena Scott wearing a rather boring grey outfit. But we produced, I think, a very, very entertaining mix of output, which was a hit from day one. And TVAM got on the air about 3 weeks later, and I know this for a fact because I was instrumental in an RTS event much later on when this was all dissected. Their audience ratings were so poor very quickly. I mean, they started off okay, but within weeks their audience ratings plummeted, and they almost got to the stage where they couldn't pay the electricity bill. It was so bad. So we knocked the living daylights out of them in terms of the way the Breakfast Time succeeded. Then I went back to programme planning, and I actually went back for a short time overseeing both channels because there was a structural mix-up. But anyway, so I did help on BBC One as well at that time.
When you were involved in commissioning, but that was really sort of, was it making editorial decisions about programmes? Someone in Manchester wanted to make a series about, steam engines or something, or the Industrial Revolution. Would you then interrogate them about content, or was it simply that you accepted that this would be, if it was coming from a production department, it would be okay, and it was just a matter of what allocation of resources you needed?
The controller had to like the idea, I guess. He had to like the idea of whatever the programme subject was going to be. But no, there was no. I mean, there might have been discussion about, well, who's going to produce it, but that was more or less left to the department. That was their concern.
Yeah.
You know, if they came up
with
an
editorial wasn't your business.
No, it was not our business.
That's fair enough. No,
and indeed, I mean, I can give you one or two interesting examples of that from Light Entertainment. We would frequently sit down at editorials with the head of comedy, and he would submit an idea, and all it was Carla Lane times 6.
Right.
Carla Lane was a very inventive and successful writer of comedy half hours. And Brian might say, well, what's going to be in it? And the department head would say, I can't tell you yet, but she's going to come up with a new idea. And such was the trust we had in that bit of output that we said, fine. And the thing was financed and costed right a long way ahead before anybody actually knew it was going to end up as Butterflies, which was one of the things she did.
Yes, because you trusted the fiefdom.
You had the
fiefdoms, didn't you? You had these very powerful heads of drama, head of Light Entertainment.
And the drama was the same, you know. You'd on BBC One, you'd commission Play for Today. You had no idea what the plays were going to be. You trusted. And sometimes it went hideously wrong. You know? Right. I mean, I remember there was a Frankie Howerd series, and it actually got completely made, or maybe 5 out of the 6 got completely made, and yet the head of comedy in those days came ashen-faced onto our planning floor one day and said, "Sorry, but we can't put this out. It's not good enough."
Really?
It's not good enough.
It's just not good enough. Yeah.
And the controller looked at it and said, no. And it hasn't gone out to this day. There's a 6-part Frankie Howerd series sitting in the archives somewhere. It hasn't gone out to this day.
It's just not good.
It's just not good enough.
Because he made a famous comeback, didn't he? And he appeared on Late Night Dine-Up, I think. And
yes, he had a new life. That's right.
His monologues and things. Yes, he was very good. So
yes.
it's before that, presumably.
Yes.
Right. So you've had this period in program planning, which sounds very interesting.
I was very happy. By then I was in my mid-50s, and so I didn't see particularly any reason to worry about my career any longer, and I was happy to go on doing that. And if you're head of planning BBC Two, there isn't any logical step forward. There isn't another job really. Yeah. You're not going to end up as controller, because that's a quite different avenue. But then the BBC bought Elstree. I won't say out of the blue, because presumably people knew about it beforehand, but I didn't. Most of us, it was a piece of genuine news. Oh, the BBC had bought Elstree. How interesting, Yes. And Michael Checklin, who was then, as it were, my boss on the 6th floor, put his head round the door and said, "Do you fancy going and running Elstree?"
Why not?
So that very day, I got a colleague of mine, Keith Anderson, who was in charge of resources, and I told him this, and Keith said, "Oh, well, do you want to go and have a look at it?" And I said, "Yeah." So he drove me out that afternoon, and we came up to Hertfordshire and drove round this site. We couldn't get in because ATV still owned it, and they weren't going to let us in, And we could peer through the gates, and I could see what it was. It was a big site with buildings on it. But I thought, well, actually, starting effectively a new television centre, from scratch.
It's a fairly run-down, ramshackle place, though, in many ways.
Well, it was run down, but it had been a going concern until a few weeks before that, you see. Mm. And of course, Mike knew that I lived out in that area, so that helped. I lived fairly near. And so I went back and said, yeah, if you want me, I'll do it, So I was given a number 2, Ian Marshall was my assistant, so there were 2 of us. We took in board one guy from ATV. ATV had gone. They'd gone to Nottingham. They'd all gone. It was an empty site, except for this one man who'd been left behind, who was actually, his job he'd been in charge of all the floor managers. That was his job. But he knew the site very well, and he had all the keys. Very important. He had all the keys, and he'd been kept on the payroll in some studio. So we took him on board as well, because he could tell us everything we needed to know about the site, And I was given a sort of services guy looking after the maintenance of the place and the buildings and all that. And I recruited someone from Current Affairs who I knew very well as a fixer, a girl, who I'd worked with for many, many years in current affairs, and I knew she was someone who just knew how to fix things. And so there were, 5 of us moved in on January 1985, I think. And the BBC's reason for buying Elstree was largely governed by their wish to start what was then at the time called a twice-weekly soap opera. It didn't have a title, but that became EastEnders, of course. And so the task really was to get the place functioning again, prepare it for EastEnders was the important task. But also I was given a brief that it had to be a facility available to anywhere in the BBC, radio and television combined. Here was 16 acres, a lot of useful buildings, 4 quite large television studios, one with audience seating, a big scene dock, a big paint room. It had all the facilities needed, office block, to run a television. It had been a television centre until a few weeks before. 16 acres, not that much smaller than television centre site. And so the whole of the BBC had to be offered it. Now, I was against that. I took the brief, of course, and anybody who approached me, can we come and have a look? I said, yeah, come and have a look, see if there's anything of any use to you. But I did my darndest to make sure that television departments got access in a rather better way than radio departments got access. To be fair, there weren't many radio departments were interested, to be honest. But, for example, we had to take on board, which I didn't want to do, the entire brass band music library from some obscure place in Broadcasting House where they were anxious to get rid of it, and they thought, Elstree, let's put it there, So I was limited in saying no to every offer, but I tried to turn it into a television centre as quickly as I could. Having said that, the first incumbent was television training, my old area. I don't know I can't remember now, whether the BBC wanted to get out of Woodstock Grove anyway. I expect they did. But certainly it was an opportunity to give television training better facilities, more office space. They could convert an existing area into a good studio, and the money was supplied to do that. It was funded properly. And so they were the first people to occupy the site halfway through the year. The target date, we moved in January 85, and the target date for EastEnders was as early as possible in 86. But they hadn't got anything really competing with Coronation Street. Twice or sometimes 3 times a week. They hadn't got that. And what Elstree provided, above all else, was an outside set.
Yes.
Where ATV had made, what was that? Auf Wiedersehen Pet was their big success.
Yes. So you built the set.
Yes.
You were there.
So very quickly, the outside set was started to be constructed, and no one thought in those days it was going to last longer than a year at the most. I mean, it's only very recently been pulled down, and they've got a new set at Elstree now, which they've spent millions on. They've rebuilt the EastEnders.
Interesting. Yeah, is that because it wasn't good enough for high definition?
Partly that. Yes, partly that, and it was falling to bits. But yes, so that was the construction. And although, of course, I had no direct involvement editorially or in any other way with EastEnders, I was making the site available to them in anything they needed. We tried to supply in terms of space and dressing rooms and all that, and getting all the maintenance work done and the decoration and the signage and all the paraphernalia of running getting the restaurant up to scratch, from literally a gas ring to a full-scale restaurant, organising commissionaires, everything you can think of that needed in running a television centre. I was running an increasingly large team of people to do it, but editorially I had nothing to do with EastEnders as a programme.
It had a studio as well as an outside set, didn't it?
It had the use of one of the 4 studios, yes, and an outside set. And, of course, subsequently it's taken over half the site. It uses every studio there. It had office space and rehearsal rooms, important. Rehearsal rooms were available instantly. They were there in the building, very good ones. Something very interesting did happen, though, which I think I would like to tell you about briefly, which was that while we were spending that year getting the place ready, we did have all this studio space which was not being used, and it was usable. And opposite us was the Elstree Film Studios, which is a much bigger concern had been there for years and years and years, making feature films. Some of it had been sold off to Tesco's, but basically quite a lot of it was still there. And this chap I mentioned to you, who had all the keys,
yes,
he was a historian as well, and he knew about the history of Elstree. And he said to us, look, I've got people approaching me from across the road wondering if you've got any spare space. Because what was happening was that a feature film would, say, book 2 huge stages over in Elstree and start shooting their film. And maybe for 2-3 weeks, they needed an extra space to do a couple of sequences. And there was nowhere else they could go on site. They knew we were opposite with empty studios. Could they come and use our space, you see? They were asking. So this was a new idea, using BBC facilities for shooting commercial films, really. So I said to him, well, will you take me across and introduce me to the guy who runs the Elstree Film Studios? Because I'd like to ask him, well, you know. So we went across, a man called Mitchell, and nice guy. And I said to him, look, we're getting approaches from people who are working on your site because they need extra studio space for a couple of weeks. He said, oh, well, he said, why don't you say yes? He said, I can't give them extra space because we're full. I have no problem with that, he said, if they want to do stuff, you know. I said, can you give me any idea of rates, you know, what I could charge? And he did. He gave me the rates. And it was good money, you know. It was like, in those days, it was, you know, £600 a day or something. I mean, it seemed to me, anyway, good money. He said, I'll give you one tip. I said, yes. He said, if they come in, he said, they'll ask for the earth, he said. They'll ask for ridiculous things. They'll ask if they can put a double-decker bus on your roof, or they'll ask if they can paint one of your buildings red. He said, they'll ask for ridiculous things, he said. He said, my tip is you just say yes. Whatever they ask for, say yes, and then charge them. You see? So I went back, armed with this new information, and said to this guy, right, there you are, you take charge of this operation. You know what the space is here better than I do. Have them in, see what they want, organise it. I left him to do it. And for about 6 months then, we took on a whole range of feature film work. We had Meryl Streep one day. That was a big day. We had Meryl Streep shooting in one of the studios. I had to put it through the unions, and the unions, in the end, a bit reluctant, said, well, OK, we can see some sense in the BBC earning some money, using space which at the moment can't be used for BBC work, as long as it's understood that it's temporary and that any money goes to enterprises, you know, it's all done properly. Yeah. And we turned over, it was something like £70,000, something like that, which was, in those days, I thought was quite a lot of money during that period. And it was very entertaining because, you know, you'd turn up one day and you'd find there was a horror sequence being shot or something. Anyway, in a sense, that's by the way, but we used the site for that purpose. And then, of course, the time came after the turn of the year into January or February when EastEnders went on the air. And that's history now. Yeah. And other,
but you had Grange Hill and all sorts of things like that.
We had Grange Hill came up and occupied the site. We used the site for other dramas. We had Allo Allo, you know, the comedy series came up turned one of the areas into a French square, and it was a fascinating time, David, because. You know, I was kind of in charge of this site, and almost had a brief to say yes to everything. It was wonderful. You know,
you almost had a train set because there was
almost had a train set.
There was a bridge with the underground.
That's right. Yes. So it was lovely, and then the next thing that happened was that I knew at the back of my mind that if you take a job with the word development in the title, watch out, because development has a habit of stopping. And my job there was head of Elstree Development. And I'd done it for a year, a bit more than a year. And the place was developed. EastEnders had begun. It was a going concern, you know. Did I have a role to play any longer, as it were? And so when the adverts went up for what happens every 10 years in the BBC, which is reinvent the regions, restructure the regions. And they restructured the regions into 5 large regions, and they created a head of broadcasting to run each of the 5, and they advertised all the jobs: head of broadcasting north, head of broadcasting southwest, so on. I applied. You applied for any of them, as it were. You put in your, and then during the interview you said which one you wanted. And basically, I made a pitch for what was then called head of East and Southeast. So it took in the whole of East Anglia, and I thought, well, this sounded a very interesting task, and so I applied for that, and I got the job. And the first decision I had to make was where to base it. Where do you run this huge region from? It included regional television at that time in Lime Grove called London Plus. Mm-hmm. It included regional television in Norwich, which I'd begun in 1959, and it included, I think, 12 local radio stations. So it's a big operation. And I had, as we all did, 5 heads of broadcasting, all had the task of recruiting a team of people to run this new operation. And where was I to base it? I suppose I had a small hesitation at that point in thinking, am I being fair, personal, in recommending it's based at Elstree? Clearly it suited me, but would it make any sense? But if you looked at the map of the broadcast map I took over, Elstree actually is kind of in the middle, And bearing in mind that you've got to go all the way to East Anglia one way.
How far south did it go?
It didn't go as far as Southampton. It went down to Brighton and a bit to the west of Brighton.
But it included London.
It included London, and it included the whole of Kent and Essex and Suffolk and Norfolk. And it included Radio Northampton, so it included Northamptonshire. It was a big patch, you see, and so I thought there was a decent argument to say, well, actually, it might not be the obvious choice, but Elstree wouldn't be a bad place to centre this region. What do you think? And I put that as a proposition. Well, in a way, there wasn't an alternative, to be honest. The BBC were very anxious to get out of Lime Grove, so they weren't going to base the region there. In fact, the reverse. I had to move the regional television operation from Lime Grove to wherever I wanted to put it, but it had to come out of Lime Grove. So in the end, the decision was made that they agreed, okay, we'll base the region at Elstree. And furthermore, it was agreed that we would move the regional television operation from Lime Grove to Elstree. Now that was a hell of a job to convince people that made any sense, really, because after all, that programme is covering the whole of London and the whole of Kent. But it was covering Kent very badly. In fact, the slang for London Plus was London Plus and sod off Kent. Yes. Yes. Could it be done? Could it be done? Well, in the end, it was done. We built a studio at Elstree for the regional television programme, and people from Lime Grove were very resistant, of course, but then, in a way, they had not much choice because they had to get out of Lime Grove. So
this was because it was being developed as for housing.
Yes, and it was thought to be old buildings, which and you're talking about John Birt's, the beginning of John Birt's era now, and he wasn't in favour of old buildings at all. And I used to have to go down to Lime Grove and talk to people there, and I got a lot of resistance, But anyway, in the end, we did it, and Newsroom Southeast was created, and it was very successful. It did very well. They had a little satellite unit in the centre of London to shoot stuff, and in the end, it wasn't that far to drive the stuff out to Elstree, and inject points were constructed so you can inject material from central London to Elstree. So the technical solutions were found. I was also anxious, and I was encouraged by the regional management to think in terms of network television from Elstree, because all the other regions, Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, and the national regions, they all did a lot of network television, particularly Birmingham and Manchester. And I thought, well, if I'm going to run a successful region, we ought to have an element of that too. Now, that's more difficult when you're so close to London. What's the rationale between about doing network television just a few miles up the road when you've got television centre, you know. But it was sort of broadly accepted by the board, I suppose, eventually, that the regional directorate, having been split into 5 regions, it was reasonable for all 5 to operate in a similar way. And Elstree had the space. Television Centre was chock-a-block. It didn't have more studio space than you know. And so I was encouraged to recruit a network television team. And eventually we were helped by the collapse of 2 London departments. OB Ensign Events ceased to exist, and its output was spread. And a programme called General Features, run by Roger Lawton at that time, ceased to exist. It lived in Centre House, opposite Television Centre, and that output was spread. And so we were the beneficiaries of that. So we inherited, almost without any effort on our part, we inherited the History and Archaeological Unit from Kensington House, which was a part of the mix. Things like Mastermind, which belonged to Ensign Events. The whole of the quiz output we ran from Elstree at that time, and we were encouraged to build documentary departments. We recruited a man called Peter Armstrong, who had been head of religion, and he was taken on as head of television at Elstree. He was very inventive and attracted very good staff. 2 years, perhaps, within 2 years, we were producing about 300 hours of network television a year.
Holby City?
Well, that came later.
That came later.
Yes. So that was working. It was working. I was then approached by Ron, and by this time we'd got to 1988. I was approached by Ron, who by then had taken over the regional directorate. He's managing director of the regions.
Ron Neal.
Ron Neal, yes. I was approached by him. A man called David Barlow was retiring, and he was controller regional broadcasting. And would I be interested in taking his job for the last 2 years of my career, because I was 58? Although, I thought, well, there's still work to do here at Elstree, which there was. I thought, well, actually, that might not be a bad move. So I said, yeah, okay. So I went and did that for 2 years in Broadcasting House, the only time I've worked in Broadcasting House.
This was the John Burt era?
Yes.
So tell us.
Well,
I mean, almost everyone we interview brings up producer choice.
Well, I was in on the early days of that. I mean, yes. John was Deputy Director General at that stage.
Mike Checkland was still DG, wasn't he?
Yes. John had come up to Elstree. He'd been everywhere, He'd gone to all parts of the BBC when he first arrived. He came to Elstree, didn't think much of it. I think he regarded this as a kind of rundown place that the BBC would be better to get rid of. Although I don't know what ideas he had about EastEnders, but when I arrived in Broadcasting House in that role as controller of regional broadcasting, I was bound to have contact with him, and then it became a particular assignment in the last year of my life there. He set up a big resources committee to look at the whole of the resources of the BBC, and I was the kind of regional rep on that, really.
Oh, yes.
And it was a very uncomfortable time. I mean, I hated every minute. The last 6 months of my BBC life was easily the most distressing time I had in the corporation. He made it quite clear from the beginning of setting up this resource group that he believed all television production should be London-based. It should all be done in London. It made no sense. You could shoot programmes wherever you like, and you must continue to shoot programmes in Birmingham, Manchester, but you don't have to administer them there. You don't need to have this huge managerial structure in 5 different places up and down the country to organise this. You can do it perfectly well, and he of course cited many examples of hosted programmes where dramas were being produced in places like Birmingham, Manchester, but essentially made by London drama departments. And what was the sense of that? So he was putting up strong arguments to prove that it would be much better if we concentrated the BBC's money on getting all the facilities in London as good as possible, and that would mean expansion, probably, but to effectively close down network television anywhere else. Now, that was what I faced as a regional representative. His style was driven by statistics and by management experts recruited from outside. And they came up with what he thought were very plausible arguments supporting his argument, you see, that efficiently that was the way to make television programs. You run it all from a central source. You have all your expertise there. Okay, if you want to film or video somewhere else, you go the other ends of the world to make the programs, including the other ends of the UK, but you don't have to have big management structures to run it, you see. So I fought that tooth and nail and made myself deeply unpopular.
Is this before the idea of producer choice?
No. It was alongside that.
Alongside.
There was another group running, what was that called? I wasn't on it, mercifully. I was just on this resources group.
Yes, I see. So there were
there
two
was
things
another
running.
Group.
One
there was
was
another
producer
group.
choice. The
Yes.
other one was a centralisation, pulling it all to the centre.
Yes. No, producer choice was not scarcely mentioned in our group. We were about resources.
I see.
And he used to produce every week mountains of... he used to arrive at my office door, things that thick, full of statistics and graphs and God knows what else, that I was meant to wade through. And I resisted like mad. And, of course, the fact that the big regions, particularly Birmingham and Manchester, did do a lot of hosted work, it ran in his favour because he was able to say, look, where are those programmes being produced from? They're being produced from London anyway. And all the arguments we would run, like, take Bristol and Casualty as a good example, you mentioned it, is a good example. Here was a very successful programme being run from a region using regional resources, and the Bristol were able to prove fairly conclusively that their resources, i.e. everything from scenery to painting to all design, everything to do with making Casualty, was better and cheaper than doing it in London. They were able to prove that. It still didn't win the argument. A lot of drama, a lot of very, very good drama was done in Birmingham under people like David Rose. You remember him?
Yes.
Outstanding drama, Boys from the Black Stuff, just fantastic drama, which was, in terms of that, was based in Birmingham. There was a drama unit in Birmingham. But Bert would argue, well, you could just as well have David Rose, running it from London. And when on the days when you want to occupy a studio to do the show, you go to Birmingham to do it. But you don't have to be there all 12 months of the year,
But that seems to go against all the idea of spreading things out, making the BBC a national organisation, etc.
Yes. I tried to make that point in committee, that actually there was real value to the BBC in having these centres of there was this phrase, centres of excellence, in different parts of the country. He poo-pooed all that, you see. He rode roughshod over all that.
But Mrs. Thatcher was, the government were actually encouraging the producer choice thing because, of course, they made the BBC take 25% of independent production, and with a threat of it going up to 40%, I think.
Yes.
But they didn't want things centralised, did they? Perhaps they did.
Well, look what happened not long after that. Salford was invented. Not so long after that.
So he didn't really win that.
Well, he won it while he was there.
While he was there, yeah.
You see, it had a big impact on my old territory because they closed down BBC South and East, and for a relatively short time, it was all run from Bristol. Huge region stretching from Land's End right the way through to the coast of Kent. Yes, my operation, which I was running from Elstree, was closed down, and all the people I'd formed as my unit there were all either fired or got rid of or moved on, or and so and then of course Holby City was invented and was based in Elstree, and very quickly, because I did go back to Elstree not so long after that to have a look, very quickly Elstree became a soap opera centre. It just did Holby City and EastEnders, and those two took over the entire site, and that's the current position. If you go now, that's all that's there.
Yeah. Tell us about the tail end of your career. I know you went to from Meridian, but
what happened then was I was in this job in Broadcast House, hating every minute of it. It must have been the Christmas of 90. I sent a card to Roger like I always did, and by then we all knew the ITV franchises were going to be auctioned off, and we knew that Roger Lawton had left the BBC and was working with a consortium making a bid. And I just put on my Christmas card, "Do you need any help, Roger?" That's all I said. Oh. I didn't hear anything. He rang me up round about July 91. He said, "Oh, you made that comment in your card." He said, "Do you want to come and have a word?" So I went and met him, and he told me a lot more about what was going on and the name of the consortium and where it was going to be based and all that. Yeah. And he said, "Would you be interested in being part of the consortium?" He said, "We don't know whether we'll get it or not." He said, "But would you be interested in being part of the group, trying to get it set up?" And so I said yes, of course, and my job was going to be regional development, head of regional development for Meridian, and there was then some really amusing moments. I mean, there was one classic moment when Roger held a kind of clandestine meeting of all the people involved in this consortium, not just the people like me closely involved, but all the people on the fringes that were helping, experts, advisors, all those people, all gathered into a room, and then through the door came walking a management advisor who 3 days before I'd been in John Burt's resources group with this guy sitting there, you see. And we did this enormous double take. Interesting. So it's full of amusing moments like that, you see. And I was a name in a brown envelope. Remember, there were people who the public were known about, like Roger Lawton, Simon Albury. Those figures were known about. But there were a lot of people in a brown envelope. People who had other jobs and didn't want to reveal. So that went on. I used to go to meetings and that. And then it got to October the 16th when the franchises were going to be declared. And I was in New York on holiday. And I'd said to my son, "Now keep an eye open. It's October the 16th. You must phone me." And he phoned and said, "You've won. Meridian have won," you see. And I got back to London sorry, I missed a bit out. At the beginning of October, I said to my head of HR lady, I want to retire early. I was due to retire in January 92 when I was 60. I said, "I want to retire early. I can't tell you why, but I want to be off the books by the beginning of October. Can you fix that?" And she said, "Yeah, if that's what you want, you'll lose a bit of pension, but peanuts really. You miss 3 months or something." So she fixed that. So I left the BBC at the beginning of October, and then I went on holiday. So when I got back to London, I could immediately go and say, "Right, I'm here. Where do you want me?" And we had offices near Southwark Cathedral. MAI was the finance group that had financed the whole thing, and
it was a breath of fresh air.
Yes, and I was very quickly sent down to Southampton, where TVS was still operating. And they were going to continue to operate for another 12 months. And we were due to take over the broadcasting in January 1993. So we had the whole year to take over, effectively, to organise everything. And so I was sent down to set up shop there with a small team of people. There were only 4 or 5 of us. We recruited a head of training. We recruited an HR lady. And we recruited an engineering figure. That was it. There was just the 4 of us, really, initially. And I was like a cuckoo in the nest, I was surrounded by 200 people working for TVS, all of whom hated us because we'd won. Yes. But all of them wanted jobs with us. So they couldn't hate us too much. So, but that was one of the most fascinating years of my career, I think, that job. It really was very satisfying and challenging and all those things, but rewarding. And we gradually recruited to that. We had there was one heart-stopping moment. Negotiations when we made the bid. you had to explain where you were going to run your operation from. So we took over on a rental basis an old carpet warehouse opposite the railway station in Southampton, and we said that's where we'll be. We'll convert that carpet warehouse to a television centre. That's where we'll be. So that was in our bid, and that was accepted, and then we won the bid. But then there came the issue, well, TVS are sitting there on a large television centre site. That would be the ideal place to be, of course, but how can we achieve it? So then there were protracted negotiations about how much it would cost to buy their television centre. And then we had the whip hand because they had nowhere to go. And they had 200 staff they wanted to get jobs for. So in a sense, we had the whip hand, but in the end, it was decided that that would work. We would buy the centre from them. But part of the deal, it was explained to me one day on a phone call from the lawyer. We'd done the deal. We're going to buy TVS's site in Southampton and run the operation from there. But I have to tell you, Keith, that part of the deal is you will be obliged to recruit from the TVS staff 150. That's the deal. Well, our total complement was 200. So of 200, I had to recruit 150 from TVS staff. So I hit the roof. I said,
whether you wanted them or not.
That's ridiculous. I said, how can I do that? That's anyway. I had to do it. No, it was fine. They were all very good people. They were good people. Yeah. But we won a lot of brownie points in that decision because take Thames, for example, taken over by Carlton. Carlton employed about 6 people from Thames, that's all.
So you maintained a local reputation for
yes, and then we went on the air in January 1993, very successfully, and I subsequently went on to do a few management tasks for Roger, and in the end
you
stopped.
Yeah, you stopped.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fascinating career. Keith, thank you very much for doing this. I hope you've not found it too taxing.
No, but have I told you anything useful?
Oh, I think so. Yes, a lot of very interesting stuff about what went on.